What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're gonna be digging into one of the best things I have ever built. This is my offset stop block. I use this for mitered casing as well as multi-piece header details when I'm casing doors and windows. It has made me a ton of money. It's allowed me to do higher quality work much faster than my competitors. I'm going to show you how it works and how you can use it in this video. Quick overview of the design and how it works. The plastic molded piece here is FastCap's Best Fence stop block. I basically just take their piece and then I create my own stop block here. You'll notice I've got a couple knobs right here. Loosen those, and that is going to allow your stop block to offset and slide. What that's going to do is it's going to offset your casing whenever you bump it to the inside here so that you can use inside measurements with the tape on your miter saw. That'll make more sense in a little bit. You can use this stop block in conjunction with my custom miter saw wings or with the Best Fence wings by FastCap. I'm going to show you how to calibrate this first. You need a miter track, obviously, to slide this on in order for it to be useful. You'll see here, I have a tape into my miter saw wings, and then on the back here, I've got my extruded aluminum track system right there that the stop block goes into. So we can just slide that on to the wings. It's a little bit sticky, but it slides right on and off with a T-track bolt right there. When doing production trim work, if we can utilize a stop block and a tape on our miter saw wings, that's a huge advantage because it allows us to be able to batch cut. The best way to ensure that you're having accuracy whenever you're cutting with miter saw wings is to have your wings attach to the saw itself. As we work, we're going to be bumping these around. We want this connection to the saw to stay nice and tight. So the way I attach my wings is with a toggle clamp right there. So it pulls the wing tight to the saw. That's critical that this not be moving around while we're batch cutting. Step one, before we start using the stop block, is always going to be to check calibration and recalibrate it if necessary. It's very easy to do with the miter saw wings that I kind of created here because my steel tape that I use with my wings is secured with a piece of magnetic tape underneath it, so I can slide my steel tape back and forth to recalibrate the stop block extremely quickly. Our steel tape, this is basically just peel and stick tape, except I don't peel the paper off the back so that it's sticky. I just leave it on, and then I put a piece of 1/2 inch magnetic tape down in this groove, and that allows me to slide this steel tape back and forth. To calibrate it, we're basically just going to take a scrap, make sure that there's a square cut on the end. There's a square cut, and it doesn't matter the length. We'll go ahead and just drop our stop block down here, tighten it so that it's not going to move, and then just carefully bump your scrap piece into the stop block. Also double check to make sure the face of your offset stop block that the pieces are flush whenever you're calibrating. So it doesn't matter where this is set, just drop it down, and we're going to cut this board off. Now to calibrate my tape to the stop block, all I need to do is measure this and see exactly what the size is. So I'm 25 3/8 strong, and then all I need to do is pull up my tape and move it so that it's 28 3/8 strong. Did I say 28? 25 3/8 strong. So I just need to move this about a 1/16 to get it calibrated here. I'm going to pull it over, 25 3/8 strong right there. Looks good. Set the tape back in. Now I'm going to bump my stop block over here to 25, and I'm going to cut it off. Double check it again. We're actually a little shy. Do it over again. Go 24.5 this time. There I am, exactly 24.5. So I've got my stop block calibrated to my tape on my miter saw wings now. This is common sense for most carpenters, but this is going to go without saying for most of you, but it is important whenever you're setting a stop block or reading a tape measure, where your eyes are in comparison to what you're trying to read matters. You want to be lined up. So whenever you're setting your stop block, I want to be looking at it dead on with my dominant eye, and a lot of times I'll even close my other eye so it's lining up perfectly. If I've got my head over here, I cannot set this stop block accurately. You have to be in line with it whenever you're setting it in order for it to be accurately. Same thing goes whenever you're reading a tape measure. It's a whole lot easier to be accurate if you're lining your eye up perpendicular to what you're trying to read. If you've got your head way over here, you're going to have a lot of inaccuracy. So make sure when you're setting this, you're getting your eye perpendicular to that string line on this stop block so that you've got everything as accurate as possible. Most carpenters are very familiar with how a normal stop block works. This would be just for cutting square cuts on anything. It could be square cuts on casing legs, could be square cuts for face frame parts. Very simple stuff. You just butt your workpiece up and make square cuts. But what about if we want to use a stop block for mitered casing? How does that work then? Well, we're always taking the inside measurement whenever we're measuring for casing. So that creates issues if we want to use a stop block to production cut our casing. We would essentially have to add double the width of the casing to all our measurements and then set our stop block to that. So if I just wanted to use this stop block like I've got it here to cut casing, and my inside measurement was, let's say, 23 inches, and I was using 3.5 inch casing, I would have to add 7 inches to that and then move this over to 30 inches, set it, and then cut my casing. That's a lot of work that does not need to be done, and that's why I created this offset stop block. It makes it easier and takes all of that math out of the equation. How do we set our outside stop block? So this is the casing that we're using in this house. It is 3.25 inch wide casing. If you're doing mitered picture frame casing, you need to double this because the outside miters are going to be twice the width of the casing to the outside measurement. So double this would be 6.5 inches. I'm going to set my offset stop block to 6.5 inches. You can do this a couple different ways. Here, I'm just going to use my tape measure and line it up so that the bottom portion of the stop block is slid over exactly 6.5 inches. Now we're ready to check our offset for calibration. We've got it offset 6.5 inches, which is double the width of our casing. As you can see here, I've got this set exactly on 6 feet. So we'll go ahead and make a couple cuts here to ensure that the offset is calibrated also, and then we're ready to start production cutting. That. We'll pivot this over to 45. I like to lift the stop block up just a little bit to ensure that I'm bumping into it where I need to be on the back side there. Make sure it's firmly in place. Here again, you can see the crosshair is right on 6 feet. Again, it matters where your eye is at because that is going to it's going to throw off your ability to read the tape if you're not square on it. So 6 foot, right on the money. I've got the inside corner lined up to the inside of my track. I'm going to pull the tape over And you can see right here, I'm off just a little bit. It's actually reading 6 foot strong, maybe even a whole 1/16 long. So I'm going to adjust my stop block just a hair to get that exactly where it needs to be. And you can see it's even showing it's a little bit strong there. Let's try that again. I'm just going to bump this down another inch to 71. And sometimes this will want to move a little bit as you tighten this knob, so you have to keep your eye on it the whole way through tightening it. Now I'm dead nuts on 71, so that's what I want. At this point, my stop block is calibrated for 2 different measurements: square cuts and mitered casing, which is offset double the width of my casing. Because this is 3 1/4, from my long point to the inside edge is also going to be 3 1/4. So if I double that, it's going to work perfect for picture framed mitered casing. So it's important to understand at this point we've got our stop block calibrated in 2 different ways. If we want to make square cuts, we can just bump to the top of the stop block and make our cuts, and it'll cut off square exactly where the tape measure says. If we want to make mitered cuts, we can move the saw over, cut our miters, and use the bottom stop block, and we can go off of the inside measurement to cut our casing. It's important to note that what we've talked about so far is going to work whenever we're picture framing our mitered casing, meaning we're mitering all the way around, or if we're doing our head pieces on doors, because we have a miter on both sides. However, if we start doing casing legs and we try to use the stop block that we've got set here, it's not going to work because it's set for double the width of the casing. And whenever we're doing our casing legs, we're only cutting a miter on the top, and therefore it's only a single width of the casing. So we would need to set the stop block for 3 1/4 offset instead of 6 1/2 offset for this 3 1/4 casing. Now my general philosophy with just about everything in life is KISS. Keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate things. And I know that as I'm explaining this, this probably comes off as a little bit complicated. I'm okay with a little bit of complexity if it creates big margins and bigger profits because of our increased efficiency. It's just going to take a little bit for you to get your mind wrapped around this process and get used to it, and then it'll become very second nature. It really isn't that complicated. Now that being said, how do we differentiate whenever we're doing our picture frame casing and whenever we're doing our casing legs and we need to only take 3 1/4 off? You can do whatever works best for you. A lot of times for casing legs, we've got sticks and I'll just pull measurements from both ends and mark it and cut it. You can do it that way, or you can batch cut your casing legs all at the same time and reset your stop block for those. You just have to keep track of it in your head, whether your stop block is offset for a single width or double the width, and not get that confused and cut a bunch of stuff on accident and have it be wrong. Now, one solution we could have to our issue switching back and forth between our casing heads and our casing legs in the different offsets is just to use 2 different stop blocks. So if I've got that stop block set for double the width, I could just grab this one and offset it at 3 1/4, set it further out on the end because obviously my casing legs are going to be longer, and just use this one as well. That would work perfectly fine. You just have to remember that you have to calibrate both of these stop blocks to your tape. You can't just throw this stop block on the saw and expect it to be calibrated. Now the way I've designed these is I have a long slot in the top of this that I'm going to show you, and that allows me to move this piece back and forth. So it's another lever that I can pull in terms of calibrating, that I can move this back and forth to calibrate this stop block. Because if I moved my magnetic tape that's already on the saw, it would throw off the other stop block. So if I want to use a dual 2 stop block setup, on my second stop block, I'm going to have to calibrate it by moving this piece back and forth and setting it that way. So here you can see the reason I can move this back and forth is because I've got this elongated slot here, and my bolt can move this entire width right here. So that's what allows me to calibrate this stop block in this method as well. I'll be honest with you though, for the almost decade that I've been using this offset stop block method, I always just use 1 stop block. I can't think of a time where I've ever had 2 set up on the saw. I get by just fine with 1, and it keeps things a little bit simpler. Now, we have to talk about the pivot point on the miter saw. This is extremely important for you to understand. We're getting down into the weeds with advanced carpentry concepts here, but if you're going to use this method of stop block, you have to understand the concept of the pivot point on the miter saw and how it works. So the brilliant engineers who design these miter saws, and I can speak specifically to the DeWalt DWS 780, the engineers at DeWalt designed the pivot point of this saw so that it moves directly in the center along the right side of the blade. You'll notice on my miter saw wings, I've got the tape and stop block on the right side, but I have nothing on the left side. That's because if you try to use that stop block with the offset method on the left side of the saw, it will not work because the pivot point is determined off of the right side of the blade, not the left side of the blade. So the blade references whenever you bolt it to the saw off of this inside edge, and the pivot point goes off of this right side edge of your saw blade. If you try to use the pivot point over here and put a stop block on the left side, the width of your blade is going to throw off the measurements on your cuts. So it'll be different. So that's why you always want to have your stop block on the right side of the saw if you're using it to do mitered casing. If you're just making square cuts, you can have a stop block on the left side. But if you're doing an offset stop block and cutting miters, you want it to be on the right side because that's where the pivot point reference is off of. Now, the second very important concept for you to understand with pivot points on miter saws. Number 1, the pivot point is determined on the right side of the blade. Number 2, the engineers have made the pivot point in line with the factory fence on the miter saw. So if you drew a cross between these 2 planes, the right side of the blade and the face of the fence, and went straight down, that is exactly where this miter saw pivots. Right side of the blade, face of the fence. Now that's a big problem if you use auxiliary fences on your miter saw, which I used to do. Now many of you know I used to use auxiliary fences that had a thin piece of aluminum that bolted onto the factory fences. Anytime I was doing mitered casing, I always had to pull my auxiliary fences off because that thickness of my auxiliary fence throws off the pivot point on the saw, and your stop block will no longer work exactly as I'm describing to you. You always had to remove these fences. But that's why I love these new crown stop fences by FastCap, is because they give me the height that I want to cut baseboard vertically, but it remains flush with the factory fence. So the pivot point stays in exactly the same spot where the engineers have designed it to be. But if you add an auxiliary fence that sticks out past the factory fence, it'll throw things off. So very important to understand that. Now let's say I'm on this 12,000 square foot house. I've got a ton of casing legs to cut, and I really just want to use my stop block to do that. How do I go about setting that up? Well, here, as we've discussed, this is currently set for 6.5 inches. Now I use just a scrap piece of steel tape on the back here. As you can see, it starts at 90 and then goes over. So ignore the top line here, but 96 and a half, that represents 6.5 inches. That's what my offset is right now. And if I pull my tape measure out and slide it under there, you can see I'm exactly at 6.5 inches. If I want to set it up for casing legs, all I would have to do is move it over here to the 3 1/4 mark. So let's just say I had a door casing leg that happened to be 5 feet long. That's not really very realistic, but we can pretend. We'll bump this over. I'm bumped over. There you can see I'm right at 5 feet. So that's how it works. 5 feet. 3 1/4 inch offset, and I can use my inside measurement then to cut my casing legs. Just covering this one more time again to make sure I'm clear. When you're setting your offset, you can just use your tape measure, bump it to the underside, and then line it up over here with whatever measurement you want. So I want 6.5, I bump it, I'm right at 6.5. I have a built-in tape measure that I put here on the backside as well. Uses the same concept, magnetic tape under here, and then a piece of steel tape. That way it's adjustable back and forth. So I don't have to pull my tape measure out to set this. I can just read the tape measure and set it, but honestly, it's just as easy to grab your tape and do this. So do whatever you prefer. This is just a little bit fancy. Now let's talk about Cutlist. The whole entire point of this entire system is because it gives us the ability to batch cut. Batch cutting is where the money is made. Batch cutting creates margin. Batch cutting increases speed and efficiency and even accuracy by using a stop block. If I was just cutting one window at a time and moving this stop block each time, I wouldn't be saving any time. You gain time because you create a cut list, and whenever you take the measurements for a large portion of the house, you're going to have a bunch of the same measurements. You're going to have a bunch of the windows that are going to be the same size. You're going to have a bunch of the doors that are going to be the same size, and that allows you to look at your cut list, pick all the identical pieces, and cut them all at once without moving that stop block. So in order for this to be effective, you've got to be making a cut list that takes a large portion of the house at one time. That way you can look at your cut list and you can cross off those like kind measurements, cut them all at the same time. So when you're making your cut list, it's very important that you number all of your openings. Each door opening should have a number. Each window should have a number. And then after you cut each piece, you're writing that number from your cut list on the back side of that piece of trim. That way you can get it back to that opening and you know exactly where it goes. So when you're making your cut list, you're going to have a number on your cut list. You're going to write that number on the wall. Usually I like to put it on the wall behind where the casing is going to be nailed to. That way we don't see it after we nail the casing on. But write it on the drywall. And then you're also going to write that same number on your casing. So it's very easy to get all of your pieces back exactly where they go. And whenever you're assembling them, it's very easy to know what pieces go together and put them all together. When I'm making a cut list, I like to make a cut list for an entire level all at the same time. That way it gives me a large sample of the house to where I can pick exact same measurements on my 2/8 doors and cut all of those for the upstairs at the same time, and 2/6, because those are all going to be the same measurements. If you do more than that, it just get this is a 12,000 square foot house, it just gets too confusing. But I like to do a level at a time. That works pretty good. Some guys might like to separate their windows and doors. Whenever I'm making my cut list, I always write a W or a D beside the measurements. That way I know whether it's a window or a door. You may like to go around and just measure all the windows at once so that they're all grouped together and then do all the doors. A lot of times I'll mix them up, whatever is easier for you and less confusing. Let's talk about some standard practices and rules that we're always going to follow when making our cut list. Number one, the number that we put on the cut list is the actual measurement of the piece of wood that we want. So whenever we're measuring our windows and doors, I'm adding the reveals as I'm measuring, and the measurement that I write down includes the reveals. So I know I need to cut the piece of wood or trim exactly as it says on my cut list. I'm not taking the jam measurements and then adding the reveals in my head at the saw. That's super confusing. I would never do that. Standard practices, we always add the reveals as we're measuring, and the number we write down includes the reveals. Next standard practice for cut lists, you're always going to have two measurements whenever you're doing your windows and doors, the width and the height. Width always goes first, height always goes second. So as I'm writing it down, if I'm doing a door and the casing is 36 by 80, 36 width by 80 height, the width is always going to go first, the height is always going to go second. I don't flip-flop those around ever. It's always exactly the same. And that way, if you're working with somebody else and you're cutting their cut list and you're trying to picture the piece that you're trying to cut, you always know what it is in your head. Let's say I had a wider patio door that happened to be 82 inches wide, and my casing legs also happened to be 82 inches wide. If I was flip-flopping those around, that could confuse me because the measurements are similar. But if I know that my width always goes first, I know, oh, okay, on this measurement, I need a miter on both sides. On the second measurement, oh, this is height, I need a square cut on the bottom and miter on the top. Standard practices, keep it simple, always do it the same. That way you know what you're doing and everybody else around you knows what you're doing too. Okay, let me show you how this can work in practice here. So batch cutting, we've got our master closet right here. And you'll notice we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 windows, all the exact same size right here. So this is prime batch cutting, money-making scenario. I should also note, I do always set up my miter saw on the main level because that's where I have my trim dropped, and then I will cut everything and then carry it to wherever I'm working. I don't carry trim off the rack down to the basement and then cut it down there. I pull it all off the rack right here, I cut it, assemble it, and then move it to the opening where it goes. This is a really perfect situation because I've got my saw right here and I can literally just pull trim right off of my trim stack onto the saw, and I'm not flipping stuff around and doing that whole number. With this particular casing, we've got a flat casing here. This is even more conducive to production cutting because I don't have to flip the saw back and forth because it's much faster to actually just flip the casing back and forth than to be moving the saw. So I can leave my stop block set up, leave my saw set up. I've got it set right here and I can just go to town batch cutting. Okay, so you can see we just cut 16 pieces in a matter of minutes, and I didn't have to pull my tape measure out one time. Next measurement, 26 and 9/16. Normally I'd be looking at a cut list up here, but I'm just doing this to demonstrate. Gonna line it up very carefully, 26 and 9/16. This is a new stop block, so it's a little tight. Usually they loosen up after a while. Okay, now we're ready to cut the top and bottom pieces. Same process. Again, you'll notice how much motion is saved with this flat casing profile because I don't have to swing the saw back and forth. I can do everything just by flipping the piece. I'll mention again, one of the foundational principles of production carpentry is not just going fast, it's mistake avoidance. So if you're batch cutting like this, you've also got to make sure you're cutting your pieces accurately. So especially if you're a beginner and you're trying to wrap your head around this, don't be afraid, pull your tape out whenever you get started on a bunch of cuts and make sure that you're actually cutting it to what you think you are. This is exactly what I want, so we're good to take off and start rolling here. This is also probably kind of common sense, but obviously you don't want to just be bashing your workpiece into your stop block. You got to be a little gentle whenever you're doing it. Just bump it. Don't run it into that stop block or it's going to throw your calibration off eventually. Another key thing, always be eliminating as many footsteps as possible. As you get set up to start batch cutting, pull a handful of pieces of casing up onto the side of your miter saw wings and let them rest there. Don't walk and grab one stick at a time. Grab a few of them at a time, whatever makes the most sense. That way you're set up and you can just keep cutting and you don't have to keep walking back and forth to the trim pile. You will also notice here, one of the reasons I love my miter saw wings and I make them this wide is because I can stack material on them as well as I'm cutting, and it also eliminates footsteps, so I can cut a bunch of stuff at once, have it stacked here, and then stop and move it over to my assembly area. So there you go, guys. You can see just how much you can boost your efficiency with an offset stop block like this. Those 8 windows, we cut 32 pieces of casing in a matter of minutes. The other beautiful thing is on a small window like that, if your lengths are off, your miters are not going to want to go together whenever you pre-assemble them. But whenever you're using a stop block, all of these are the exact same size. That's going to help the miters be perfect and it's going to just work really well. Just stop and think, if I had to pull out my tape measure every time on each one of those cuts and mark it, how much extra motion is there and how much longer is it going to take to do that? I was able to cut all these pieces. I didn't have to pull my pencil out. I didn't have to pull my tape measure out. I was just able to go to town. Can't emphasize enough how important this is. When I started out in carpentry, I knew I had quality standards that were higher than what a lot of my competitors, probably most all of my competitors, were going to do. But if I wanted to compete with them, I had to figure out how to do the same job better and faster to be more competitive and to make more money. This stop block has been huge with that. It's allowed me to be extremely fast and productive when I'm doing door and window casing, and it's just been worth its weight in gold. Hope this video helps you guys. I use these videos to train my own guys as well, and I needed to make a video on how to set up the stop block, calibrate it, and use it. So you got a lesson, and I'm just telling you how to do it as if you were on the job site with me and I was training you to work on the same houses that I'm doing. So I hope it helps. If you got any questions or comments, drop them below. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.